Hi there. It's July the 30th and we're continuing our progress through Paul's letter to the Romans, and we're in chapter 13 and we're reading the whole of the chapter from verses 1 to 14. So Paul here is continuing his practical outworking of the covenant of grace that he has been expounded in the first 11 chapters. And in this chapter particularly, he's drawing on some very practical teaching that has its roots in the teaching of Jesus. Paul, as a Roman citizen, would have been very used to Roman law. He was one who actually called on the protection of Roman authorities himself, and who called Roman authorities to account when they were guilty of not obeying, not following the rules themselves, such as when he was beaten in Philippi. So Paul tells the believers in Rome, of course Rome the centre of this authority, he tells them to obey the authorities because the authorities, not because the authorities themselves are worthy of respect, but because they've been put in place, they've been permitted to be there by God himself. One thing the scriptures don't really do is to extol one form of government over another, but what it does do is it calls us to relate properly to government, and also to be prophetic to government and to call them to account. But here Paul is saying respect the authorities because they represent something of God's heart and God's being. They represent something of the order that God brought at creation into the world. And therefore Paul says that we should be paying taxes, we should be giving tribute, we should be giving honour. Now that's very interesting considering the forms of taxation that the Romans levied. Of course they farmed out the taxes and there was a lot of sharp practice going on. That's why the tax collectors, particularly in Judea, that Jesus has to do with, have such a bad reputation because they tended to charge more than they should. But Paul is very clear here, not to denigrate those practices. And of course Jesus himself, when asked should we pay taxes to Caesar, said render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. And so in that sense Paul is just reflecting what Jesus has already taught. Paul then goes on to say, owe no one anything apart from the debt of love. And this again is something that is drawing on Jesus' teaching. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest commandment, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul and strength, and your neighbour as yourself. And so Paul here is reflecting that actually all of the Torah, all of the law, all of the commandments are summed up in this one Torah law, this one mitzvah, this one commandment, love your neighbour as yourself. This was contained in the Torah itself in Leviticus 19 and verse 18. But this little mitzvah becomes one that Jesus says sums up the others, and Paul is repeating that here. And he says that the reason that we should be living out in this way is because we are living in the light of a kingdom to come. We are living in the light of rescue that is coming. We're living in the light of a kingdom of heaven that is coming to earth. And therefore we're to put away the fruitless practices of the darkness, and we're to live as children in the light. And we're to put on Jesus as our clothing. We are to make Messiah our protection, and we are not to make allowance for the desires of our flesh that want to take us over. This is Paul being really practical, but again, as I say, following up what Jesus has said. He's in the light of Jesus, which suggests that Paul will have had access to the sayings of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus through his fellow apostles back in Jerusalem. Let us remember that God has created an order. He's not a God of disorder. He's not a God of anarchy. He's a God who is one who desires us to relate properly to those authorities that there are. Have a very good July the 30th.